At the end of 1941, a terrifying incident took place in the emergency hospital set up at Stanley College, Hong Kong. We are talking about the period of the Pacific War and the Japanese invasion of Southeast Asia, by the way. The cruelty of this war was unprecedented. On the night of December 25th, Japanese soldiers from the main invasion force of Hong Kong had forced their way into this hospital. The Japanese killed 2 doctors and gang-raped all the British and Chinese nurses throughout the night. All the patients were bayoneted and 2 nurses were decapitated outside the hospital on the tennis court. And this Hong Kong incident was just a beginning. On the morning of February 9th, the Japanese began bombing Singapore, and 4,000 Japanese troops landed on the northwest coast of the island. And on February 15th, Singapore fell to the enemy as the Commonwealth forces couldn't hold out much longer. At that time, there were 140 evacuated Australian Army nurses in Singapore. All of them had already heard about the unimaginable horrors that befell their colleagues in Hong Kong. December 25th became known as Black Christmas. The nurses were told that if they found themselves in a similar situation, it might be better for them to be shot by their own people than fall victim to the Japanese. None of us can even imagine the sheer terror these women must have felt. On February 11th, 4 days before the fall of Singapore, the first group of nurses was successfully evacuated back to Australia aboard the Empire Star. Another group of 65 nurses departed on the ship Vyner, Brooke, which was bombed by 9 Japanese planes and sank at 1:40 p.m. on February 14th. Several lifeboats were damaged during the attack. Many people had no choice but to jump into the ocean and try to swim to safety. Many people drowned. The ship went down between Sumatra and Banka Island, which was fortunately only 16 kilometers away. On the night of February 14th, 2 lifeboats landed on the island. We are talking about 22 Australian nurses and about 30 passengers. A small group went to a nearby village to seek help, but the locals, fearing punishment from the Japanese, declined. The nurses soon found out that the entire island had been occupied by the Japanese and that they should probably surrender to the local occupation authorities. About 2 hours later, a group of around 20 British soldiers, many seriously wounded, also landed on the island. Given the circumstances, all the castaways eventually decided to go find the Japanese units and inform them of their complicated situation. By around 10 a.m., one of the men returned accompanied by 15 Japanese soldiers led by an officer. What followed is known from the testimony of Vivian Bullwinkle, the sole survivor out of the 22 nurses. What we know is that the Japanese first separated the women from the men and then the healthy from the wounded. One group of British soldiers was taken behind a cliff where they were likely bayoneted. About 10 minutes later, another group of men was led to the same place. This time the nurses heard gunfire, suggesting that some of the men might have attempted to escape. The Japanese then told the nurses to walk into the sea. Once the water was up to their waists, a hail of automatic gunfire hit them. Only Vivian Bullwinkle survived the massacre. When she finally dared to come out of the water onto the shore, she was by herself, completely alone and wounded. All her colleagues were gone, killed by the Japanese, and the sea had taken their bodies away. Vivian went into the jungle, alone. Yuki Tanaka, the author of Hidden Horrors, speculates whether the nurses were raped before being killed. I guess we will never know. He also talks about the possibility that, and I quote, the soldiers who massacred the Australian nurses on Banka Island were the same soldiers who had raped and murdered the British nurses in Hong Kong 2 months before. Now let's delve into the sad story of a tiny and secluded German village called Hansdorf. This small village was, and perhaps still is, located in the federal state of Mecklenburg, Western Pomerania, in northeastern Germany. As the Third Reich was falling apart, a heartbreaking tragedy struck this little village. But to get the full picture, we need to understand the atmosphere of that time, especially in these eastern regions of Nazi Germany, where all the inhabitants waited in little terror for the arrival of the Soviet Red Army. I guess all of them deep down knew they wouldn't just get away with all that evil. The sad truth is, it's often the innocent and vulnerable who end up suffering the most. That's how it always goes. That's how they always wanted it to go. The Germans in these areas had a pretty good idea about the terrible things their forces did on the Eastern Front, and how they treated innocent Soviet people. The atrocities committed in the East, in the occupied parts of the Soviet Union and in Poland, were incomparable to those committed, for example, in France, Belgium, or Denmark. Why? Well, in the East lived the so-called subhumans, the Slavic, Asiatic peoples, and you, as a German, could do anything to them, even kill them if that's what you wanted. The Germans knew the Allies, especially the Soviets, would want revenge for all their slaughtered families, burned villages, and bombed cities, but their fear was also fueled by intense Nazi propaganda. Right before the fall of the Third Reich, all the newspapers and leaflets warned that if German men couldn't stop the so-called Bolshevik horde of murderers, then this horde would dishonor and slaughter their women and innocent little German girls. On February 24, 1945, as the Red Army was already moving through Silesia and East Prussia, heading towards Berlin, Hitler declared, and I quote, "What this Jewish plague will do to our women, children, and men will be so appalling that the human mind cannot even comprehend it." Because of this intense propaganda and perhaps a bit of a guilty conscience, the German nation was gripped by overwhelming fear. It felt almost like a mass panic. And this wave of fear and panic takes us back to the tiny little village in Pomerania. On May 4th, 1945, when the first Red Army soldiers were spotted near the village, and rumors spread about several women already being raped by them, 3 local men decided they would do anything possible and impossible to avoid such a disgraceful fate. They wanted to make sure they and their families didn't end up in the hands of the Soviets, in the hands of those ugly Bolshevik cannibals. Those men were Martin Brindel from Mimodorf, his father-in-law, Christian Kunst, and the local farm tenant. On May 6th, Brindel led his family to Lake Hayden, and there he committed something unbelievable. First, Martin grabbed his 12-year-old daughter, Annelore, and slit her throat, his own daughter's. His wife met the same fate. Brindel's terrified 10-year-old son Herbert and 6-year-old daughter Helga tried to flee from their mad father, but their own grandparents, the Kunsts, held them until their father killed them with a club. He likely bludgeoned them to death. Martin then also drowned his 2-year-old son Hans. In the end, Christian Kunst also killed his wife. Both men had planned to commit suicide after this massacre. However, they ultimately decided not to go through with it, and instead arranged the bodies of their wives and children to make it appear as though they'd been brutally and murdered by some Soviet soldiers. On that same day, the farm tenant shot his wife, his daughter-in-law, and then himself. After the war, the murderer Brindel remarried as if nothing had happened and even joined the Socialist Unity Party of Germany. It wasn't until 1962 that the entire fraud was exposed. Both Brindel and Kunst were subsequently found guilty and sentenced to death. Regardless of what we think about the concept of collective guilt, we shouldn't forget that at the end of World War II, an estimated 806,000 German women and young girls were raped. Miriam Gerhard, the German author of When the Soldiers Came, suggests that around 190,000 of these rapes might have been committed by US soldiers. Now, let's move to the very heart of Europe, to occupied Czechoslovakia. At that time, it was known as the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Surely you've heard of these two Czech villages, Lidice and Ležáky, which were burned down by the Germans during World War II. Almost all of the inhabitants were exterminated. But have you ever heard of the tragedy that occurred in the small Czech village of Leskovec? I'm almost certain you haven't. It's almost like a local legend. Sadly, a 100% true legend. Among the people, this heartbreaking event is known as the burning of Yuki's mill in Leskovec. On the morning of April 3rd, 1945, farmer Jan Juříček and his entire family of 5 were abruptly awakened by loud banging on the door and urgent shouts. "The forest is full of Germans, you are surrounded." Almost immediately, the family found itself facing the Gestapo. The Germans were searching for a partisan hideout, which was indeed located in Juříček's mill in the village of Leskovec. The Red Army was already on the outskirts of Berlin, yet there was still time for such a heinous crime. The Germans kept killing until the very last moment. I guess they just couldn't help themselves. The Germans stormed into the house and began searching for the hideout. They started by removing the oak boards that camouflaged the bunker's window. Using 3 grenades, they blasted open the entrance, which was a wooden door cleverly disguised by a goat feeder. The bunker was now exposed. That morning, 6 partisans were hiding in the bunker beneath the living room, adjacent to the barn. 3 of them, Saška Čorný, Sergej Sorokin, and Oldřich Kaňok, tried to shoot their way out and escape, but they died in the unequal fight. Oldřich committed suicide. As the house filled with smoke from the fire, the 2 surviving partisans, Konstantin Yefimovich Kalabalin, known as Kostya from Kharkov, and Vasil Fyodorovich Sapelnik, slipped out and hid in a concrete pipe that drained water from the mill wheel. Submerged in cold water, they endured an astonishing 12 hours. Meanwhile, the entire Juříček family was led out of the house with their hands tied. Under pressure from the Gestapo, badly beaten Jan Juříček called out to the remaining partisans to leave the bunker. "Boys, if any of you are still alive, come out." It's hopeless. The family was subsequently shot and their bodies thrown into the fire. The youngest victim was not even 14 years old. After the Germans left, the 2 surviving partisans made their way to the nearby village of Seninka or Prlov. We do not know exactly. The following day, Vasil carried Kostya on his back to see a doctor in Vizovice, because they both came down with pneumonia. Did you know the bunker was first built as a hideout for František Bednář, Josef Sousedík and their families? These 2 men were the masterminds behind the planned Wallachian anti-fascist uprising. Some of Josef Sousedík's important plans and inventions were also hidden in the bunker, but the Germans probably stole them. We can only guess what was so valuable about those documents. Now let's move to the time of the Russian Civil War. Millions died during this time. Both the Red Army and the White Army were incredibly brutal. And today I'd like to tell you about one chilling practice from this period that really caught my attention. Floating prisons known as death barges. These barges were transformed into makeshift prisons packed to the brim with detainees, more often than not with POWs. Given their location, for example, on the Volga River, escape seemed almost impossible. Conditions on these barges were appalling. With limited access to food and clean water, diseases such as typhus and dysentery spread very quickly. The prisoners were packed tightly with hatches nailed shut for days on end. They were only given a small piece of bread, often moldy, as their daily ration. And at times, they were simply left to starve. The sick were left to defecate where they lay, with feces oozing onto those below them. Decomposing bodies lay mixed with the living, as maggots feasted upon them. The stench was overwhelming, and the daily sights were grotesque. Prisoners had to live like this for weeks. The story of a prisoner Bolshevik Vasiliev gives us a glimpse into life on the Yaroslav death barge. On this barge of death in the middle of the river Volga, the vast expanse of water and alert guards made escape almost impossible. The prisoners used logs as some sort of minimal protection against bullets, which were being fired all around them. Days were filled with hunger and uncertainty. Vasiliev talks about how he gradually lost all his strength and occasionally even his consciousness. There wasn't even a place for him to lie down in the evening. The exact details of how the Yaroslav death barge floated away remain ambiguous to this day. It's unclear whether the prisoners managed to set it adrift or if the barge was carried downstream because the anchor rope snapped due to the gunfire. What is known is that the barge eventually landed in a Bolshevik-controlled area.